They called it the forest, but to those who entered it, it was more than a place. It was a living thing. The trees breathed, the shadows watched, and the wind carried secrets older than the men who hid beneath its canopy. It was here, in the damp heart of the Aberdare range, that the oath of freedom was first whispered, a promise carved in fear, sealed in blood, and born from the ache of a land that had been taken. Kenya in the early 1950s was a country split between silence and rage. The British Empire still stretched across the map like a vast shadow, but its edges were fraying. On paper, it was called a colony, a jewel of East Africa blessed with fertile highlands, cool climate, and orderly farms. In truth, it was a wound, a land where the soil itself remembered whose hands had tilled it first. The Kikuyu, the largest of Kenya's peoples, had lived among those highlands for generations. Their fields grew maize and millet, their herds grazed on rolling slopes, their stories tied them to every river, every hill. But when the white settlers came, the land was renamed, fenced, and measured not in ancestry but in acres. The best of it, the Highland Belt, was declared white man's country. Its original owners were pushed to reserves, their farms seized for plantations of coffee and tea. By 1950, over 1 million Africans lived crowded on the thin red earth of the reserves, while fewer than 30,000 Europeans controlled nearly all arable land. To govern this imbalance, the British relied on fear disguised as order. Chiefs were appointed by the crown, not by the people. Taxes were levied in coin, forcing men to work on settler estates to survive. The whip and the ledger ruled side by side. In Nairobi, European clubs glittered with gin and laughter, while outside their gates, black men swept the streets that bore no memory of their names. But beneath the quiet routines of colonial life, anger had begun to smolder. It started as whispers in the markets, in the fields, in the huts at night, talk of lost land, of broken promises after the Second World War, when African soldiers had fought for the empire and returned home to find themselves servants again. They spoke of uhuru, the word for freedom, passed from mouth to mouth like a forbidden prayer. To the settlers, it was a threat. To the Kikuyu, it was a heartbeat. In the highlands around Nyeri, a young man named Dedan Kimathi was among those who could no longer bear the weight of patience. He had been a teacher, a clerk, a soldier in the King's African Rifles. He knew the empire's discipline and its hypocrisy. When he looked upon the rows of coffee trees stretching across stolen land, he saw not prosperity, but theft with a uniform. He began to organize in secret, joining what was known then as the Kenya African Union, a movement that preached petitions, not war. But the petitions went unanswered. The governor called them agitators, the settlers called them savages, and the silence from London was louder than any gun. So the talk turned darker. In the forests, groups of men and women gathered by night. They were farmers, clerks, servants, veterans, ordinary people bound by extraordinary desperation. They formed societies of secrecy and resistance, and in their language they called themselves the Muma wa Wigwano, the Oath of Unity. The British would later call them Mau Mau, though no one truly knew what the name meant. Some said it was a curse, others an acronym. But to those who swore beneath the moonlight, it was simply the word for courage. The ceremony of the oath was not taken lightly. It was said that once spoken, it bound the soul forever. In a clearing deep within the forest, an elder would raise a gourd of goat's blood mixed with the sap of the magumo tree. The initiate would kneel, hand upon the earth, and repeat words older than empire, that they would reclaim the land, that they would never betray their brothers, that they would fight until freedom or death. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and fear. Somewhere in the distance, a hyena cried, a reminder that even the forest had its spies. For the colonial government, these rituals were proof of barbarism. Newspapers in London printed stories of witchcraft and savagery. The settlers in the highlands armed themselves, whispering of uprising. But for those who took the oath, it was not witchcraft, it was justice. The oath was a declaration that their humanity could no longer be bargained, that the land and the people were one, and that to betray either was to cease being human at all. The first attacks came quietly. A settler's cow found dead, a storehouse burned, a loyal chief ambushed on a lonely road. The British police responded with arrests and beatings. Villages were searched, men dragged from huts in the night. For every suspect captured, 10 innocents suffered. The logic of empire was simple. Fear breeds obedience, but fear had changed sides. By 1952, the government could no longer pretend it was facing mere bandits. The violence spread through the Central Highlands, and the governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, declared a state of emergency. British troops arrived, bringing machine guns, barbed wire, and a new vocabulary of control: detention, screening, rehabilitation. Hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu were rounded up into camps, their villages fenced into protected zones. Officially, these were measures of safety. In truth, they were cages. Kimathi retreated deeper into the forest, leading what would become the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. His men lived among the roots and mist, striking from the shadows and vanishing again. They fought with stolen rifles, with machetes, with whatever the land could give them. They were hunted by planes, by dogs, by their own kin turned collaborators. Yet each capture, each death, only made the legend stronger. They called him the Lion of the Forest, a prophet of blood and redemption. His followers sang songs that mixed scripture with defiance. "We will return the land. The white man will go. Our children will eat where we once starved." In the towns, the British built new prisons called pipeline camps, where men were screened for loyalty. Those who confessed were rehabilitated. Those who refused disappeared. Torture became routine: electric shocks, beatings, water, fire. The records would later be buried in archives marked secret, but the scars lived on in silence. Women were forced to denounce husbands, sons forced to watch fathers die. The rebellion became not only a war for land, but a war for the soul itself. Outside Africa, the world barely noticed. The headlines spoke of Suez, of Korea, of the Cold War. Kenya was a footnote, a colony at the edge of empire. Yet in the forests, history was being rewritten by men who had no maps, only memories. For every British officer who saw savagery, there was a Kikuyu mother who saw sacrifice. For every report of terror, there was a child who whispered the name Mau Mau like a prayer. The years between 1952 and 1955 were years of fire. Villages burned, plantations smoldered, the forests bled. The British called it the emergency. For the rebels, it was the beginning of rebirth. Entire families disappeared behind barbed wire. Thousands were executed after summary trials. Others were forced into villagization, fenced communities meant to starve the rebellion of food and loyalty. And yet, despite the cruelty, the oath held. The people still whispered, still hid food in the fields, still sent messages through song. Freedom, once imagined, refused to die. Kimathi's letters from the forest were written on scraps of paper, smuggled through sympathizers to Nairobi, to the world beyond. In one, he wrote, "Tell them that we fight not for revenge, but for the right to be men again. The land is not the white man's gift to us. It is our mother's womb." He knew they were losing ground, that the British were too strong, but he also knew that victory was not measured in battles won, but in ideas that could no longer be killed. By 1956, the rebellion was collapsing. Betrayal crept into the ranks. Bounties were offered. The forest that had protected them began to whisper names to the enemy. Kimathi was captured that October, wounded and delirious, carried out on a stretcher beneath the same trees where he had once preached freedom. They hanged him the following year in Kamiti prison. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. The British declared victory. The camps remained full, the villages fenced. The newspapers in London printed photographs of smiling officials shaking hands, proclaiming peace restored. But peace built on silence is only another kind of war. For a decade after Kimathi's death, his name was forbidden. To speak of Mau Mau was to invite arrest. Yet in the villages, his story lived on in whispers, in songs sung to children who would one day inherit the freedom he died for. Kimathi had once said, "The world may not hear us now, but one day it will." And he was right, because the forest remembers everything: the blood that sank into its roots, the whispers that passed from tree to tree, the songs that rose even as villages burned. What began as an oath beneath a fig tree would one day echo in parliaments and classrooms, in songs and in silence, long after the guns had fallen still. History, patient and merciless, had been listening all along. The war for Kenya's soul was fought not only in the forest, but in the shadows of offices, in the corridors of colonial power, where pens were deadlier than rifles. In Nairobi, beneath the slow whir of ceiling fans, British officials wrote memos that turned suffering into policy. They called it rehabilitation. They called it pacification. They called it progress. But what it truly was the systematic breaking of a people who had dared to remember what freedom felt like. After the declaration of emergency in 1952, the British administration set out to restore what they called law and order. In practice, this meant control, total, unrelenting control over bodies, minds, and land. Villages suspected of aiding the Mau Mau were surrounded by soldiers at dawn. The people were gathered into lines, heads bowed, hands raised. Men were taken for questioning. Women were forced to kneel in the dust, their children crying behind them. The screening process was supposed to separate the guilty from the innocent, but the line between them was written not in justice, but in fear. Confession was the only proof of loyalty. Silence was treated as rebellion. And in that silence, entire generations disappeared. The detention camps became their own world, an empire within an empire. They stretched from the Rift Valley to the coast, hidden behind fences of barbed wire and euphemism. To the officials in London, they were called works camps, places where detainees could learn discipline and civility. To those inside, they were places where the air itself seemed to hum with cruelty. Thousands of men were forced to dig trenches, carry rocks, or stand under the sun for hours as punishment for crimes they did not commit. At night, the interrogations began. The guards, African loyalists under British command, were often more brutal than their masters. They used fists, sticks, electricity, and words that could cut as deep as any blade. They had been taught that fear was a kind of loyalty, that breaking others would keep them safe. Some believed it, others did it to survive. The line between victim and executioner blurred, as it always does when the system itself becomes the weapon. Officially, torture was never sanctioned, but unofficially it was an open secret. Reports of beatings, of hangings, of bodies found in rivers reached London and were buried beneath layers of denial. The empire could not afford to admit that its civility was a mask. To rule by the gun was acceptable. To rule by the whip was embarrassing. So the language changed. Torture became interrogation. Villages became settlements. Slaves became workers. Every word was chosen to sanitize the horror, to make it palatable to the conscience of empire. In the settlements, families lived behind barbed wire, their lives reduced to rations and routine. Each dawn began with the sound of whistles, orders barked in English, and the dull ache of hunger. Children learned to count their portions before they learned to read. Disease spread through the camps like gossip, quiet, unstoppable. Mothers buried infants in unmarked graves, whispering the same prayer each time, "Let this child wake in a freer world." The British settlers in the Highlands slept with rifles beside their beds. They saw themselves as the last guardians of civilization surrounded by savagery. Their newspapers printed headlines about Mau Mau terror and African madness, accompanied by grainy photographs of burned farms and murdered loyalists. They never printed the photographs of the camps or the bodies beaten beyond recognition. Those were for the archives, not the headlines. In London, the politicians spoke of Kenya's troubles with weary detachment. To them, it was a colonial headache, an administrative problem, not a moral crisis. They assured Parliament that the situation was under control, that reforms were coming, that the Africans would be grateful when peace returned. But peace to whom? The settlers saw peace as submission. The soldiers saw it as silence. The people saw it as the absence of chains. And none could agree which peace was worth dying for. Amid this machinery of oppression, a quiet war of truth began to take shape. Missionaries, journalists, and a handful of British officials who could still see beyond the mask started to document what they saw. They wrote secret letters to London, describing the camps, the screams, the endless confessions beaten out of men who no longer remembered what they had confessed to. Some of these letters reached the desks of politicians who would later claim ignorance. Others vanished into drawers marked confidential. In the forest, meanwhile, the rebellion continued to burn, smaller now, scattered, but alive. Women carried food and messages through the valleys, risking execution for a handful of maize. Children served as couriers, slipping between patrols, their innocence their only camouflage. The British called them passive supporters. The rebels called them heroes. Kimathi's name had become legend. To some, he was a ghost haunting the mountains. To others, he was a criminal whose death would restore order. The truth, as always, lay between. Even as his army weakened, his words grew stronger. He told his followers, "We may die, but our children will see the dawn." The British tried to erase him, but the more they silenced his name, the more it echoed. In 1954, the colonial government launched Operation Anvil, a vast dragnet meant to choke the rebellion once and for all. Nairobi was sealed overnight. Soldiers blocked every road, every alley. Africans were herded into open fields, separated by gender and age. The screening began again. Questions, beatings, accusations. Thousands were deported to camps, thousands more vanished. The city, once vibrant with whispers of rebellion, became a place of fear. The markets fell silent. The air smelled of smoke and disinfectant. The empire had tightened its fist, but the harder it clenched, the more humanity slipped through its fingers. Yet even in that darkness, the seeds of liberation were being sown. Among the detainees were men who would later lead the nation, teachers, farmers, clerks, who learned to organize even within captivity. They shared stories, songs, strategies. They watched the guards, learned their patterns, and learned patience. In the stillness of the camps, they began to imagine a future beyond survival. The irony of empire was that in trying to break the spirit of a people, it taught them endurance. The Mau Mau may have been defeated militarily, but the idea of freedom had already escaped the forest, moving invisibly through the cities into schools, churches, and hearts. By 1956, the British claimed victory. The emergency continued, but the rebellion was officially over. The government released reports praising the re-education of the detainees, the restoration of order, the return of peace. Photographs were staged, smiling Africans shaking hands with officers, waving tiny flags of the Union Jack. The newspapers called it progress, but the progress was built on bones. When the war finally ended in 1960, the numbers told only part of the story. Officially, 12,000 rebels had been killed. In truth, the dead were countless, villagers shot without trial, children lost to famine, women who vanished in camps. The empire's books showed order restored, but history's balance sheet was red. The British left behind roads, schools, and prisons, symbols of civilization, they said. But they also left behind something far more enduring, a silence so heavy that it took generations to break. The survivors rarely spoke of what they had seen. The shame of defeat, the fear of retribution, the desire to forget, it all buried the truth deeper than any grave. Yet, time, like the forest, is patient. In the years that followed, whispers began again, not of rebellion, but of remembrance. Journalists uncovered hidden files, old soldiers began to talk. Women who had once carried food into the forest told their grandchildren what they had done. Slowly, the story of the Mau Mau returned, piece by piece, from the darkness where empire had tried to hide it. Kimathi's grave was never found. Some said it was beneath the prison yard at Kimathi, others that the British burned his body to prevent it from becoming a shrine. But in the minds of his people, he was never buried. His face appeared on murals, his name in songs, his words in speeches. He became not a ghost, but a guide, a reminder that freedom is never given, only taken. The empire's mask had cracked, and through the cracks, the truth began to shine. The British left Kenya in 1963, but the memory of what they had done stayed long after their flags were gone. For years, the official histories called the Mau Mau a tribal disturbance, but in time, those words would rot. The truth, buried and beaten, would rise. And when it did, The world would see what the empire had tried to hide, that beneath the rhetoric of civilization, there had always been chains. Beneath the silence of order, there had always been screams. And beneath the mask of progress, there had always been blood. The empire called it victory. History called it shame. In the years that the Forest War raged, the land itself became both witness and accomplice. Every furrow of red soil held a secret. Every river carried the memory of what had been done in its name. Kenya's earth had always been fertile, but now it was soaked with something far older than rain. For those who lived through those years, the land became a mirror of their own divided souls, half alive, half haunted, waiting for the reckoning that history always demands. Among the Kikuyu, land was not merely property, it was identity, lineage, and faith. To lose the land was to lose one's place in the world. The British had known this. That was why they took it first. They called it Crown Land, as if a king thousands of miles away could own mountains he had never seen. The settlers came with documents and rifles, cutting boundaries across hills where the dead still slept. Fences went up, roads followed. They said they were bringing progress. But what they built were walls, between races, between classes, between past and future. For the white settlers, the land was a blank canvas, something to be tamed, measured, made productive. They called it the White Highlands, a name that carried both geography and warning. They saw beauty in the fields they had plundered, pride in the order they had imposed. To them, the Mau Mau rebellion was not about justice, but jealousy. They believed the Africans hated them for their success. In truth, the Africans hated only what had been stolen. At night, the forests glowed faintly with the fires of hidden camps. Men huddled under makeshift shelters, rifles across their laps, listening to the distant hum of British patrol planes. The rebels were hungry, sick, and hunted, but they were also bound by something stronger than fear. They believed the land itself was on their side, that the spirits of the ancestors walked with them, unseen but felt in every rustle of leaves. When a man fell in battle, they buried him quickly, whispering the words, "He returns to the soil will remember." Inside the detention camps, the prisoners dreamed of that soil. Many of them were farmers who had never imagined living behind wire. They woke each morning to the smell of disinfectant and sweat, their bodies aching from forced labor. The British called it rehabilitation. The detainees called it slow death. Every command was delivered in English, a language many did not understand but had learned to fear. Disobedience meant beatings. Resistance meant disappearance. Some tried to escape. Most never made it past the fences. Yet even there, among the barbed wire and the mud, humanity survived. The men shared what little they had. A scrap of bread, a whispered prayer, a joke told quietly enough not to draw a blow. They carved messages into the wooden walls of the huts, tiny lines of Kikuyu script that said things like, "I am still here, and God sees." Those who could write English penned letters to families who might never receive them. In those lines were fragments of dignity that no system could erase. In one camp near Naivasha, a man named Karanja became the unofficial teacher. He had once worked as a clerk for a British company before being accused of aiding the rebels. Each evening, after the guards passed, he would gather the younger prisoners and teach them to read using scraps of old newspapers. They learned from articles about London politics and sports scores, translating them into their own secret lessons. "They write that freedom is the crown of civilization," Karanja told them. "Then let us become civilized enough to claim it." The guards, many of them African loyalists, lived in a torment of their own. Some were former rebels who had switched sides to save their families. Others had never believed in the rebellion, but were forced to choose between hunger and betrayal. At night, when the white officers retired to their quarters, the African guards sat by the fires and stared into the dark, haunted by the faces of the men they had beaten during the day. Some wept quietly. Others hardened themselves with drink or cruelty. Empire had taught them that mercy was weakness and weakness was death. Among the settlers, the fear of uprising turned to paranoia. Women slept with pistols under their pillows. Men patrolled their estates with dogs and shotguns. Children were taught to stay indoors after sunset. Every rustle of wind in the tall grass sounded like danger. Yet they refused to leave. "This is our home now," they said. "We have made the desert bloom." They did not see that it was blooming on borrowed time. Back in Britain, the empire's narrative continued to hold. The official report spoke of loyalty restored and order returning. Politicians praised the moral courage of the settlers and the discipline of the colonial government. The Mau Mau were painted as savages who had turned on their benefactors. Photographs of mutilated bodies were circulated as proof of African barbarism. None of the photographs showed the bodies hanging in the camps, the scars from the interrogations, the women who vanished into the forest and never returned. The empire understood that truth was the most dangerous weapon of all, and so it controlled the story as tightly as it controlled the land. But the truth has a way of surviving. Stories leaked through missionaries, through letters smuggled to sympathetic journalists, through soldiers who could no longer bear the guilt. One such man, a British corporal named Ian Henderson, later confessed that the war had changed him in ways he could not explain. "We thought we were fighting savages," he wrote in his memoir, "but in the end, I realized we were the savages, and they were the ones fighting to be human." His book was banned in Kenya for years, but his words spread quietly, passed hand to hand like contraband scripture. For the Africans, survival meant adaptation. Some joined the Home Guards, policing their own villages to prove loyalty to the government. Others pretended obedience while secretly feeding the rebels. Families were torn apart by suspicion. A father could not trust his son. A wife could not trust her husband. The rebellion had made spies of everyone. Yet beneath that fear, the idea of uhuru remained. It was the word that would not die, the ember that refused to go out. As the years dragged on, exhaustion settled over the land. The British built more schools, more roads, more churches, hoping to wash the blood away with progress. They spoke of development, of modernity, of preparing Kenya for self-government someday, though never soon. But even as they built, they knew they were losing control. The cost of empire was rising, in money, in morality, in the eyes of a world beginning to question the righteousness of colonial rule. In London, a new generation of politicians began to see the colonies as liabilities, not trophies. India had already gone. Ghana was rising. The winds of change were blowing across Africa, and even the most stubborn imperialists could feel the weather turning. Kenya, once considered the jewel of East Africa, was becoming a curse, a name whispered in Parliament with unease. The turning point came not with a battle, but with a memory. In 1957, a small article appeared in a British newspaper describing the death of a man named Kariuki in a detention camp. The details were vague, but the tone was unmistakable. He had been beaten to death during interrogation. A young journalist named Barbara Castle took notice. She began to investigate, interviewing former soldiers and missionaries. What she uncovered was the empire's hidden skeleton, a network of camps where torture was routine and justice a myth. Her reports reached London, and for the first time, the public began to ask questions. The government dismissed them as exaggerations, but seeds of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, inside Kenya, a quiet transformation was underway. The very men who had been imprisoned began to rise as political leaders. Jomo Kenyatta, once accused of being the leader of Mau Mau, emerged from detention a symbol of unity. His calm demeanor and careful words reassured both Africans and Europeans that the future could be built on peace, not vengeance. Yet beneath his moderation lay the memory of what had been endured. The British had made him a prisoner. History would make him a president. By the late 1950s, the rebellion had faded into whispers, but its spirit had spread everywhere. The forests grew quiet, but in the cities, the people began to gather again, not with rifles, but with placards and speeches. The slogans were the same: land and freedom. The methods had changed, but the fire was the same. The British could no longer shoot ideas, and that was what frightened them most. When independence finally came in 1963, the Union Jack was lowered and the Kenyan flag raised in its place. The crowd in Nairobi's Uhuru Park erupted in celebration. Fireworks burst above the skyline. Drums pounded through the night. For the first time in memory, the land belonged to its people again, or so they believed. But freedom, as history always reminds us, is not a moment but a mirror. Beneath the cheers and the flags lay questions that no one wanted to ask. Who would own the land now? Who would speak for the dead? Who would rebuild what had been broken? The settlers who stayed behind called it reconciliation. The Africans called it unfinished business. The soil of Kenya had absorbed too much to ever be innocent again. Its beauty remained, the golden savannas, the snow-capped peak of Mount Kenya, the rivers glinting under the sun. But beneath that beauty ran a quiet ache, a reminder that the land had been paid for twice, once in blood and once in silence. Years later, when farmers tilled the highlands, their plows still unearthed remnants of the past, bullets, chains, fragments of uniforms. The children would bring them home, asking what they were. The elders would sigh and say, "The land is remembering." And in that simple phrase lay the entire tragedy of Kenya's colonial century. Because the land never forgets. When the war ended, the gates of the camps did not open all at once. Freedom, like dawn, came slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid of what it might reveal. For years after the emergency had been declared over, barbed wire still cut across the landscape of Kenya, shimmering under the sun like a scar that refused to heal. The British called the camps rehabilitation centers. The survivors called them graves that still breathed. For those who had lived behind the wire, the outside world was both a promise and a threat. Many had forgotten what it meant to walk without orders, to speak without fear, to choose silence for peace instead of survival. The camps had been their world, their schools, their prisons, their purgatories. Some had entered as rebels, others as bystanders, but all had left as witnesses. The British had designed the camps not merely to punish, but to reshape. They believed that the African mind could be cleansed of rebellion through discipline and labor. Men were divided into categories: black, gray, and white. Black meant uncooperative, defiant, dangerous. Gray meant uncertain, redeemable. White meant loyal, trustworthy, safe to return to the reserves. Every man was expected to climb the ladder through confession. The more you confessed, the closer you came to freedom. The truth of those confessions mattered less than the act itself. It was not honesty they wanted. It was obedience. In one camp, a detainee named Wambugu later told his grandson, "They asked me to confess that I had taken the oath. I said yes. Then they beat me and said I was lying. So I said no. Then they beat me again. I realized it was not about truth. It was about power. They wanted to see who would break first." He never forgot the lesson. He carried it in his bones, in the way he flinched at the sound of boots on gravel long after independence. The camps were places of inversion, where morality was turned inside out. Guards who were once neighbors now stood above prisoners who had once been their leaders. Men who had fought for freedom were made to build roads for their captors. Each day began with roll call, each evening with sermons on loyalty. The white officers spoke of civilization and duty. The Africans repeated their words like prayers, hollow and exhausted. The British believed they were teaching order. What they were really teaching was despair. Women, too, were not spared. While men were sent to detention centers, women were confined in emergency villages, fenced compounds surrounded by police posts. They were forced to grow food for the army, to attend daily roll calls, to watch as their husbands and sons were marched away. Some joined the rebellion as couriers, smuggling messages hidden in baskets of maize. Others suffered quietly, bearing the burden of survival in a system designed to erase them. One woman, whose name history has almost forgotten, became known among the detainees as Mother of the Forest. Her husband had been executed. Her sons had disappeared. She refused to leave the camp even after being offered release. Instead, she stayed behind to care for the sick, to comfort the dying, to remind them that the world outside still existed. "They can cage our bodies," she told them, "but not the wind." After independence, she disappeared into the countryside. Some said she became a nun. Others said she returned to the forest where it had all begun. Her name never appeared in any official record, but her words lived on, repeated in whispers by those who survived. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the machinery of empire began to rust. Britain, exhausted by wars and debts, was rethinking its colonies. The violence in Kenya had been expensive, not only in money but in reputation. Reports of atrocities had begun to reach Europe. Missionaries spoke of abuses. Journalists described disturbing methods of interrogation. The government denied everything, But denials no longer silenced the questions. The world was changing, and the empire's language of moral superiority no longer convinced even its own children. In London, a new generation of students and activists began to ask why a nation that prided itself on democracy was running concentration camps in Africa. Politicians spoke carefully, using words like regrettable excesses and isolated incidents. But in Kenya, no one needed euphemisms. They had lived the truth. Inside the camps, the guards grew uneasy. They sensed the shift in the wind. Orders from above became contradictory. Some prisoners were released, others transferred without explanation. The officers spoke less about rehabilitation and more about reconstruction. They said Kenya's future would be built on partnership between races, on mutual respect. But partnership built on pain was still a form of dominance. When the first wave of prisoners was finally released, they returned to villages that no longer felt like home. The land they had left behind had changed hands. The people they had known had learned to forget. The loyalists had taken positions as chiefs and policemen. The rebels returned as laborers. The war had ended, but its hierarchy had survived. A man named Njoroge, who had once fought under Kimathi, described the first night of his freedom. "I came home," he said, "and my wife did not recognize me. My children were afraid of me. I had dreamed of this day for years, but when it came, I realized I no longer knew how to live." He tried to farm, but the soil felt foreign. He tried to pray, but his words felt hollow. The only thing that still felt real was the memory of the forest, the sound of the wind in the trees, the echo of his own heartbeat when he had sworn the oath. For many like him, freedom was a wound disguised as healing. They walked through the new Kenya carrying ghosts that no one wanted to see. The new government, eager to build unity, discouraged talk of the Mau Mau. The term was banned from public discourse, replaced by the language of progress. Schools taught that independence had come through negotiation, not rebellion. The men who had fought were told to move on, to forgive, to be silent. The forest became a place of shame rather than pride. But silence, like empire, has its limits. In the privacy of their homes, the survivors kept their stories alive. They told them to their children at night in whispers. They spoke of oaths and betrayals, of hunger and hope. They did not seek revenge, only remembrance. "If we forget," one elder said, "then they will have killed us twice." Meanwhile, the British government quietly began to destroy the evidence. As independence approached, officials ordered that sensitive documents be burned or shipped back to London under secret classification. Files labeled Operation Legacy recorded the systematic removal of archives that detailed torture, executions, and illegal detentions. They were stored in hidden vaults for decades until the 21st century, when a handful of them were finally declassified. In those pages were the ghosts of an empire, names, dates, numbers, and the bureaucratic language of cruelty. One memo described a policy called the dilution technique, a euphemism for breaking prisoners through physical torment. Another outlined how uncooperative elements could be neutralized without formal trial. Reading them, historians would later say, felt like opening the mouth of the grave itself. In Kenya, few ever saw those papers. They didn't need to. They had lived them. The smell of smoke and disinfectant, the sound of boots on gravel, the sight of a man broken but still breathing, these were their documents. Their history was written not in ink but in scars. As the 1960s dawned, the new nation tried to redefine itself. Independence brought pride but also unease. The people celebrated, but the old divisions lingered. The loyalists became the first bureaucrats. The rebels became farmers, watchmen, teachers. Some were honored in secret ceremonies. Others were forgotten entirely. The government, fearing new uprisings, chose stability over truth. The word Mau Mau was banned from the airwaves for nearly 2 decades. The very struggle that had birthed the nation became its taboo. And so the forgotten prisoners remained forgotten, not only by the empire that had caged them, but by the country they had helped to free. Many died poor, unacknowledged, their graves unmarked. Some left behind diaries that were never published. Others left nothing but silence. But history has a strange way of reclaiming its own. In the early 2000s, a group of elderly Kenyans, survivors of the detention camps, decided to sue the British government for crimes of torture. They were in their 80s and 90s, their bodies frail, but their resolve unbroken. They stood before the High Court in London and told their stories, in voices cracked by time but clear with truth. One woman said, "They took my husband, they beat me, they burned my house. They said it was for peace, but peace built on pain is not peace." At first, the British government denied responsibility, claiming that the records had been lost, that too much time had passed. But then, the hidden archives of Operation Legacy were uncovered, and the lie collapsed. In 2013, after years of legal battle, Britain finally acknowledged what it had done. The Foreign Secretary at the time, William Hague, issued a formal apology, stating that the government sincerely regrets the abuses that took place during the emergency in Kenya. It was a cautious apology, limited and diplomatic, but for those who had waited half a century, it was something more than words. It was validation. Outside the courtroom, the survivors wept, not for victory, but for memory. One of them said softly, "Now the world knows we were not mad, we were human." The compensation they received could not erase the past, but it allowed them to be seen. And that, after all those years, was its own kind of freedom. Back in Kenya, when the news reached the villages, old men sat beneath the mugumo trees and nodded. They had always known that the truth would return, just as the rains always return to the land. Some said that the forest had finally spoken. Others said that the ancestors had demanded justice, but most simply said, "At last." The forgotten prisoners were forgotten no longer. Their stories had crossed the ocean, forced open the vaults of empire, and spoken across generations. And in doing so, they had completed the circle begun under the moonlit oath so many decades before. The empire had tried to bury them. History had brought them back. Independence came with fireworks, parades, and songs that reached every corner of Kenya. But when the drums faded and the flag settled, silence returned, heavy, expectant, uncertain. On December 12, 1963, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time, and the new flag rose into the morning light, black for the people, red for their blood, green for the land, white for peace. The crowd in Nairobi's Uhuru Park roared. They danced barefoot in the grass. They shouted until their voices cracked. It was the moment generations had dreamed of, the moment the chains broke. And yet, for many, freedom felt both too soon and too late. The British governor stood beside Jomo Kenyatta, shaking hands for the cameras. The image was printed in newspapers around the world, the smiling colonial official, the calm African statesman, the perfect picture of reconciliation. Few noticed the shadows behind them, the veterans of the Forest War standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, uninvited, unacknowledged, their tattered clothes a reminder of the price paid for that day. They watched the ceremony from afar, unsure whether to cheer or mourn. They had fought for Uhuru, for land and dignity, not for flags and speeches. Yet they said nothing. They had learned that freedom, like silence, can be a form of survival. Kenyatta addressed the nation that day. His voice was steady, deliberate, almost paternal. "Our children will grow up in a free Kenya," he said. "The past is dead. We must not look back in anger, but forward in unity." The crowd applauded, but in the villages, among those who had seen the camps and the forests, the words cut deep. For how can a people heal from wounds they are forbidden to remember? In the months that followed, the new government moved swiftly to build a modern state. Roads were paved, ministries established, schools opened. The old colonial offices were repainted and filled with new faces, African faces. The empire was gone, but its architecture remained. The same desks, the same documents, the same hierarchy. It was as if the country had changed its flag, but not its spine. The loyalists who had sided with the British during the war were among the first to be rewarded. They became administrators, policemen, and landowners. The government called it integration. The rebels called it betrayal. Many of the men who had fought in the forest returned home expecting recognition, perhaps a small piece of land to farm, a pension for their sacrifice. Instead, they found nothing. The government dismissed them as troublemakers, relics of a violent past best forgotten. The word Mau Mau was still taboo, banned from public speech, forbidden in schools, erased from textbooks. Kenyatta, once accused of leading the Mau Mau, now denied them. "We do not want to live in the past," he told the press. "The Mau Mau were misguided. We are all Kenyans now." His message was clear. Unity required amnesia. The cost of peace was silence. But silence has its own sound. The low hum of resentment, the quiet creak of dreams deferred. In the highlands, where the best land had been held by settlers and their loyalist allies, thousands of veterans and their families were left landless. They built shacks on the edges of the farms they had once tilled. They called these places the Forgotten Villages. Each morning they walked past the fences that separated them from the fertile soil that had once been theirs. They watched as government convoys drove by, carrying men in suits who spoke of development and progress. They heard the words nation building and wondered if the nation being built had space for them. One veteran, named Mugo, who had fought under Kimathi, tried to petition the government for land. He was told to bring proof of his service. He laughed bitterly. "Proof? My proof is here," he said, showing the scars on his back. But scars were not documents. He died years later, still living in a hut made of corrugated iron, his children working as laborers on the estates that had once belonged to British settlers, now owned by Kenyan politicians. Meanwhile, the new elite grew comfortable in their inherited offices. They wore Western suits, drank imported whiskey, and sent their children to schools in London. They spoke of African socialism, but lived like colonial aristocrats. The revolution had devoured its own children, replacing the foreign masters with local ones. The veterans called it black faces, white hearts. The newspapers called it progress. The irony was cruel. Those who had suffered most for freedom were told they were unfit to enjoy it. Their anger was dismissed as bitterness, their poverty blamed on laziness. In official speeches, the word Mau Mau was used only as a warning, a reminder of chaos, of savagery, of what Kenya must never become again. The story of resistance had been rewritten as a story of shame. And yet, beneath that official silence, the memory refused to die. In the countryside, songs and proverbs carried the truth where history books would not. Mothers sang lullabies about the forest, about the men who fought and the women who waited. Children learned to whisper the name Kimathi like a prayer. Elders told stories around fires, careful to speak only in trusted company. "The trees remember," they would say, even when men forget. Kenyatta's government consolidated power quickly. The Kenya African National Union, KANU, became the only dominant political party. Dissent was equated with disloyalty. Newspapers were censored, opposition voices silenced. To challenge the president was to challenge the nation itself. For people who had once fought to break chains, the return of fear felt like betrayal disguised as order. In 1969, when a young politician named Tom Mboya, a symbol of modern Kenya, was assassinated, the illusion of unity cracked. Riots broke out in Nairobi, soldiers patrolled the streets. The government blamed outsiders, but everyone knew the rot had begun within. The same hunger for power that had fueled the colonizers now consumed the liberators. By the time Kenyatta died in 1978, he was a hero to some and a disappointment to many. His face was on the currency, his name on schools and streets. But in the villages, people still lived as they had before, plowing the land for others, waiting for a future that never came. The man who had once spoken of freedom had become the father of a system built on inequality. When Daniel Arap Moi succeeded him, he promised renewal. He spoke of peace, love, and unity. But peace without justice is submission. Love without equality is illusion. Unity without truth is silence. The veterans of the forest grew old watching governments rise and fall, always hearing the same promises, always seeing the same results. Their children learned to stop asking about the past. Their grandchildren grew up not knowing it at all. In schools, the history of the Mau Mau was reduced to a paragraph. Teachers skipped it or whispered it, afraid of losing their jobs. Students learned about the explorers, the missionaries, the governors, and the presidents, but not about the men and women who had died for the soil beneath their feet. It was as if the nation had built its foundation on a grave and refused to acknowledge the bones beneath. Yet, history is stubborn. In the late 1980s, a new generation of writers and artists began to challenge the silence. They published plays, poems, and novels that dared to speak of the forbidden years. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, once imprisoned for his words, wrote that a nation that forgets its freedom fighters condemns itself to repeat its chains. His works were banned, but they circulated secretly, copied by hand, between students like sacred texts. The government called him a traitor. The people called him a prophet. By the turn of the century, the truth was seeping back into the public consciousness. The grandchildren of the forgotten began to ask questions. Why were the forests haunted? Why were the old men silent? Why did the government still fear a word that belonged to its own history? The elders began to speak again, slowly at first, then with growing urgency. They knew time was running out. "We are the last witnesses," they said. "When we die, the truth will die with us." In 2003, when a new government came to power under Mwai Kibaki, it promised transparency and reconciliation. Commissions were formed to investigate the crimes of the past, not just those of the colonial era, but also those committed by post-independence regimes. Yet even these efforts struggled against the weight of denial. Politicians feared the ghosts of history. The powerful feared what the truth might cost. The cycle of silence continued, dressed now in the language of democracy. Still, something had changed. The British apology in 2013 rekindled old memories, not just in the courts, but in the hearts of the people. For the first time, the Mau Mau were officially recognized as freedom fighters. The government built memorials. School books were rewritten. The name once whispered in shame was now spoken with pride. But for many, the gesture came too late. The veterans who had waited their whole lives for acknowledgement were dying one by one. "We were heroes when we were young," one of them said. "Now we are ghosts in our own land." Kenya had become a nation of contradictions, free yet unequal, modern yet haunted, proud yet uncertain of its own story. In Nairobi's glass towers, businessmen spoke of progress and globalization. In the countryside, farmers still fought for deeds to the land their ancestors had bled for. The forest that once hid the Mau Mau was now a national park, its paths walked by tourists with cameras, its silence broken by the laughter of those who did not know what had happened there. Beneath their feet, the roots still whispered. Freedom, it turned out, was not an end but a beginning, and like all beginnings, it demanded truth. The betrayal of freedom was not just political, it was moral. To forget those who had fought was to betray the very idea of liberation, and yet, even in betrayal, hope endured. The same soil that had absorbed the blood of the fallen continued to nourish new generations. The same forests that had hidden rebels now sheltered birds whose songs echoed the rhythm of old oaths. The land, patient and watchful, waited for its people to remember. Because no nation built on silence can remain whole, the ghosts always return, not to haunt, but to remind. And in Kenya, as in all places born from struggle, the past is never truly past. It is the voice beneath the wind, the pulse beneath the earth, the shadow beneath the flag. It waits, not for vengeance, but for recognition. Long after the flags had been raised and the speeches forgotten, Kenya settled into the uneasy rhythm of a nation trying to live with its ghosts. The roads were new, the offices freshly painted, but beneath the concrete and the slogans, the earth still breathed the past. The land remembers what men try to forget. It holds their bones, their sweat, their unspoken prayers, and it whispers them back to those who listen closely enough. In the highlands, where the air is thin and the soil the color of rust, farmers still wake before dawn to tend the same fields their ancestors once fought for. They bend over the furrows as their fathers did, their hoes striking the ground with the steady rhythm of endurance. To the outsider, it looks like peace. But if you stand still long enough, you can feel the tension beneath it, the weight of history pressing through the soil like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. The grandchildren of those who fought in the forest grow up in the shadows of stories half told. Their parents, who were children during the war, speak of it only in fragments. They say, "Your grandfather went to the forest and never came back," or "Your grandmother carried messages in her skirt," and then they change the subject. The young ones learn to sense the borders of silence the way others learn to read fences. They know there are things you can ask and things you cannot. And yet, the questions linger. In schools, the history books have begun to change. The chapters that once skipped over the Mau Mau now mention their names, briefly, carefully, in the language of balance. The Mau Mau uprising, the books say, was a complex period in Kenya's struggle for independence. The words are neat, sterile, safe. They do not bleed. They do not scream. They do not show the faces of men dying in camps or women carrying bullets in baskets of maize. But even these small sentences matter. They are cracks in the wall of silence, and through those cracks, the light begins to enter. In Nairobi, a new generation of artists begins to dig where politicians fear to tread. They paint murals of Dedan Kimathi on city walls, his face stern, his gaze unbroken. They make films that show the forest not as a myth, but as a memory. They write plays that bring the unspoken to life, where ghosts speak the truths that the living cannot. In small theaters lit by flickering bulbs, audiences sit in silence as actors reenact the oaths, the arrests, the screams. Some weep, some leave. Some stay until the lights return and the applause feels more like prayer than celebration. Among the Kikuyu elders, oral history becomes both weapon and refuge. They gather the youth beneath the mugumo trees and tell them what the schools cannot. They speak of the night the oaths were sworn, of the smell of earth mixed with blood, of the songs that rose from the forest when all seemed lost. They do not romanticize it. They speak of betrayal, of hunger, of mistakes, of the terrible price of freedom. They remind the young that history is not a story of heroes and villains, but of choices and consequences. The forest, one elder says, did not care who was brave. It only remembered who kept their word. In the towns, the descendants of loyalists and rebels live side by side, often unaware of which side their ancestors stood on. The old divisions have blurred, but not vanished. Land cases drag through courts for decades. Some estates still bear the names of the British families who once owned them, even though the owners are long gone. The past has a way of writing itself into deeds and boundaries. The land itself is a record, every fence a line of history, every river a witness. For those who seek to uncover that history, the work is slow and painful. Historians interview survivors whose memories tremble between clarity and forgetting. They dig through archives in London, reading the same documents that once hid the truth. Each file is a revelation and an accusation. The bureaucratic language is cold, but the meaning burns. Transfer of detainee, neutralized. Punitive expedition, success. Uncooperative elements, eliminated. These are the sentences that built an empire. And when the historians read them aloud to the survivors, the old men nod, not in surprise, but in recognition. "We told them this," one says quietly. "They just didn't listen." In 2015, a group of young filmmakers traveled to the Aberdare forests to record testimonies from the few living veterans. They bring cameras, microphones, notebooks. The veterans bring memory. One old man, almost blind, sits on a wooden stool and speaks in Kikuyu for hours, his words rolling like a river. He does not need prompts. His story has been waiting 70 years to be heard. He describes the smell of gunpowder, the taste of rain, the faces of comrades buried beneath roots and leaves. When he finishes, the crew sits in silence. One of them, barely 20, asks him what freedom means now. The old man smiles and says, "Freedom is when the truth no longer hides." The young are listening again, and that, more than anything, frightens the powerful. Because memory is contagious. Once it begins to spread, it cannot be stopped. The children of farmers become students, the students become activists, the activists become teachers, and the circle of remembrance widens. They start community museums, recording oral histories before the elders are gone. They collect artifacts, machetes, medals, faded photographs. They hang them on walls not of marble but of tin and wood, small shrines to endurance built with borrowed nails and stubborn pride. Visitors come and touch the objects with reverence. Some cry, some simply nod. The past has found its voice again. In the rural hills of Nyeri, where Kimathi was captured in 1956, a statue now stands, bronze and solemn, one arm raised, the other holding a rifle. At its base are the words, "He died for our freedom." Every December, people gather there to lay flowers and sing. Old women in headscarves, young men in jeans, school children holding small flags. They come not to glorify war, but to remember its cost. When the hymns end, there is always a moment of silence. The wind moves through the trees, the leaves whisper, and for that instant, it feels as if the forest itself is breathing again. But remembrance is not simple. With every story told, another question rises. Who betrayed whom? Who profited while others bled? Who speaks for the dead and who speaks for themselves? Memory is not justice, but it is a beginning. And beginnings, however painful, are sacred. In Nairobi, a journalist publishes an article titled, "The Land That Remembers." It traces the ownership of a single farm from the colonial era to the present, from a British settler to a loyalist chief, then to a cabinet minister, then to a corporation. The article ends with the question, if the land could speak, whose name would it say? The government ignores it, but the public does not. People begin to talk again about redistribution, about reparations, about truth. Some call it reopening old wounds, others call it healing. Meanwhile, the veterans who are still alive grow fewer each year. Their faces are carved by time, their hands twisted by age, but when they speak of the forest, their eyes still sharpen. They are not asking for glory, only remembrance. They want their grandchildren to know that freedom was not born from speeches, but from sacrifice. We were the roots, one says. The tree that stands now grows because we are buried beneath it. In the city, on the anniversary of independence, the president gives a speech before a sea of flags. He speaks of unity, prosperity, and the bright future ahead. Cameras flash, choirs sing, jets streak across the sky. But far away in the countryside, a handful of elders sit outside a small community hall and listen to the radio. They nod politely at the familiar promises, then turn it off. Let them speak of tomorrow, one says. We will speak of yesterday. Both are needed for a country to stand. Night falls over the land. The fields glow with the faint fires of homesteads. The stars hang low over Mount Kenya, and somewhere in the dark, the cry of a hyena rises, the same sound that once echoed through the forest during the years of war. The world has changed, but the land has not. It remembers the footsteps of the rebels, the boots of the soldiers, the weeping of mothers. It remembers everything. And perhaps in that endless memory, there lies a lesson that freedom is not only about what we win, but what we choose never to forget. Because the land forgets nothing. It waits, it watches, it forgives slowly, if at all. And when the time comes, it tells its story again through those who have learned to listen. The land that remembers is not silent. It speaks through the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of hoe against soil, the laughter of children playing on ground once stained by blood. It speaks through the rain that falls on graves unmarked and the rivers that carry whispers to the sea. It speaks through the people who survive, tired, proud, imperfect, and free. Freedom, it seems, was never a destination but a dialogue between the living and the dead, between the land and those who walk upon it. And as long as the land remembers, the story is not over. Progress came dressed in glass and concrete. Nairobi rose from its colonial shell like a creature reborn, its skyline stabbing the clouds with new ambition. Neon lights blinked where watchtowers once stood, highways cut through the old coffee plantations. The air smelled not of dust and fear, but of gasoline and promise. The nation called it development. To the elders, it felt like forgetting. Factories opened. Radios filled the air with slogans of growth. Politicians stood before microphones and declared that Kenya had entered a new age, an age of roads, schools, hospitals, and hope. They spoke of independence not as memory, but as proof of destiny. We are no longer the children of empire, they said. We are the architects of our own tomorrow. And for a while, people believed them. The cities swelled. Farmers sold their goats to send sons to university. Daughters left the villages to work in offices with fluorescent light instead of moonlight. The new generation spoke English fluently, wore suits and skirts instead of kongas and hides, read newspapers instead of oral tales. They spoke of markets, exports, and technology. They said the future had no use for ghosts, yet the ghosts followed them, quietly, invisibly, woven into the fabric of everything that glittered. The old colonial roads that carried goods to the ports still followed the same paths carved by empire, routes designed for extraction, not connection. The companies that mined the soil and exported its riches still bore foreign names. The plantations still echoed with songs of labor, only now the overseers were local. The flag was new, the anthem different, but the rhythm of exploitation had changed little. In the countryside, mechanization came like a second conquest. Investors bought vast tracts of land in the name of progress, turning the soil with machines that roared louder than thunder. The small farmers who had once dreamed of owning the land found themselves tenants again, paid to harvest crops they could never afford to eat. They watched tractors roll past the graves of their ancestors and wondered if freedom meant surrender by another name. Cities became magnets, pulling people from the villages with the promise of wages. Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, each pulsed like a heart fed by the veins of migration, but hearts can also break. The slums grew faster than the skyscrapers. Corrugated iron roofs glittered in the sun like scales of a sleeping beast, stretching for miles. Children played barefoot between open drains. Women lined up at dawn for water. Men searched for jobs that existed only in rumors. They were the inheritors of both liberation and neglect, free citizens of a nation still learning how to see them. The leaders spoke of progress in numbers, GDP, output, productivity, words that filled reports and emptied bellies. They believed that growth could silence the past, that paved roads could replace justice, that electricity could light what history had darkened. They forgot that ghosts do not live in darkness, they live in memory. The ghosts walked beside the workers on the morning buses. They lingered in the archives of ministries built on colonial blueprints. They whispered in the corridors of power where foreign advisors drafted policies that mirrored those once written by imperial administrators. The vocabulary had changed, but the grammar of dependence remained. Loans replaced laws, debt replaced chains. The empire had become invisible, but its shadow was long. Foreign corporations returned, this time with contracts instead of guns. They came for coffee, tea, flowers, and oil. They came with briefcases, consultants, and clauses written in small print. They promised partnership but demanded profit. They praised freedom but preferred control. The British called it investment. The Americans called it opportunity. The Kenyans called it survival. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the global market turned cold. Oil crises, droughts, and debt crushed the optimism of independence. The International Monetary Fund arrived with its language of austerity. Structural adjustment, they called it, a polite phrase for cutting the poor to feed the numbers. Subsidies vanished, schools charged fees, hospitals ran out of medicine. The people who had once believed they were free now stood in longer lines for smaller portions. Progress had become a ghost that everyone chased but no one could touch. And yet, amid the hardship, resilience remained. Kenyans built new worlds out of necessity. Matatus, the colorful, chaotic minibuses, became symbols of defiance, painted with slogans, faces of musicians and political graffiti. They raced through traffic blaring reggae and gospel, declaring with every horn blast that freedom could still be loud. Street markets thrived, powered by women whose hands moved with the precision of survival. The informal economy became the real economy, a rebellion against invisibility. The government, wary of unrest, spoke of patriotism and stability. The police patrolled not only the streets, but the imagination. Writers were censored, activists jailed, students expelled. The old fear returned, dressed in new uniforms. But fear, like empire, never lasts forever. In whispered meetings and underground journals, a new generation began to reclaim the language of liberation. They read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Frantz Fanon, and Chinua Achebe by candlelight. They argued in dorm rooms about identity, memory, and power. They began to see that the struggle for independence had not ended with the flag. It had only changed shape. In the villages, elders watched this new restlessness with both pride and caution. They had seen what happens when hope becomes fire. "Be careful," they said. "Freedom burns as easily as it shines." But the youth did not listen. They wanted justice, transparency, equality. They wanted the promise of Uhuru fulfilled, not postponed. Their protests filled the streets in the 1990s, demanding multi-party democracy. Tear gas replaced gunfire, slogans replaced oaths, but the spirit was the same: defiance in the name of dignity. When the one-party state finally cracked, it did not crumble in explosions but in exhaustion. The people had outweighted their masters once again. Kenya entered a new era, one of pluralism and press freedom, though both came with limits. Old ghosts retreated, but they did not die. They lingered in land titles, in courtrooms, in the unspoken hierarchies that still divided the nation. Progress marched on, cell towers rising beside colonial courthouses, glass malls casting reflections on war memorials. The future glittered, but the ground beneath it trembled. The children of independence now sent their own children abroad to study, repeating the migrations of privilege in reverse. And back home, in the dust of forgotten villages, the descendants of the forest fighters still tilled the soil without deeds. Yet, even in that imbalance, the land whispered hope. Community groups began to plant trees on the sites of old camps, turning prisons into gardens. Artists painted murals where walls once bore bullet holes. Teachers taught not only arithmetic, but remembrance. Universities opened courses on colonial resistance where students debated the ethics of forgiveness. For the first time, history felt less like a wound and more like a mirror. Painful, but necessary. Foreigners came again, this time with cameras instead of rifles. They filmed documentaries about the Mau Mau, interviewed survivors, wrote books titled The Forgotten Revolution. Some Kenyans welcomed them, others resented them. "We told these stories long ago," an elder said. "They ignored us. Now they come to sell our pain back to us." But he still agreed to speak, because silence had been worse. Technology changed the rhythm of remembrance. Social media turned memory into conversation. Photographs of old fighters went viral. Young people shared them with captions like, "They fought for us." The internet, once seen as a distraction, became an archive. Oral histories found new homes in podcasts, YouTube channels, digital museums. The ghosts of progress found new voices. But not all progress was kind. As skyscrapers rose, rivers darkened with pollution. As wealth grew, inequality deepened. Corruption became the new colonialism: internal, relentless, invisible. The elite built walls higher than any fortress of empire, guarded by the poor whose dreams they borrowed. In the slums, children recited pledges of unity each morning before walking through sewage to school. The paradox of freedom had never been clearer. Still, the spirit that had carried the nation through empire and emergency refused to die. It lived in the laughter of matatu conductors who quoted politics like poets, in the songs of women pounding maize under tin roofs, in the art of youths who painted broken walls with faces of those long gone. It lived in the stubbornness of the land itself, wounded, exploited, yet endlessly fertile. Progress was real, but it was haunted. Every skyscraper cast a shadow shaped like a memory. Every anthem of success carried an echo of the old songs of resistance. And perhaps that is what freedom truly meant: not perfection, but persistence, the ability to build while remembering, to rise without erasing, to live with ghosts and still dream forward. At night, when the city quiets and the wind sweeps across the highlands, the past and the present blur. The hum of traffic merges with the distant drums of an old ceremony. The lights of Nairobi shimmer like the fires that once burned in the forest. Somewhere, an old veteran turns in his sleep, hearing both. The ghosts of progress are not vengeful. They are watchful. They wait to see whether the living have learned the lessons written in blood and silence. Because the story of Kenya, like the story of all nations born from struggle, is not about victory or defeat. It is about endurance, and endurance, like the land, remembers everything. The 21st century arrived quietly in Kenya, not with trumpets, but with tension. The air in Nairobi buzzed with cell phones and ambition, yet beneath the noise was something older, heavier, waiting. The people had grown used to living with ghosts, but ghosts do not stay silent forever. They demand acknowledgement, not vengeance. And the new generation, born after independence, raised after dictatorship, connected to the world through invisible networks, began to listen. For decades, the story of the Mau Mau had been spoken in whispers, confined to funerals and kitchen fires. But by the early 2000s, it began to rise again, in classrooms, theaters, and newsrooms. The old words returned, reshaped by new tongues. Students recited names that had once been forbidden: Dedan Kimathi, Field Marshal Muthoni, General China. They debated the meaning of freedom and betrayal in the same breath. Some saw the Mau Mau as martyrs, others saw them as symbols of a nation's unfinished business. Either way, the silence had been broken. Museums that once displayed colonial artifacts began to host exhibitions titled Unheard Voices. Inside glass cases sat rusted chains, tattered uniforms, fragments of letters written from detention camps. Visitors walked through dim corridors filled with sound. Recorded testimonies of survivors played on loop. The voices were calm, weary, resolute. "We were told to confess to sins we never committed," one said. "We were told to forget, but the land remembers us." School children stood before those exhibits in awe, their faces lit by flickering projectors that played black and white footage of a history they had never been taught to see. At the same time, a movement for justice was gathering momentum beyond Kenya's borders. In London, lawyers representing elderly Mau Mau veterans filed a case against the British government for torture, forced labor, and inhumane treatment. It was not just a lawsuit, it was a reckoning. The plaintiffs were old. Some walked with canes, others with memories too heavy to carry, but they were determined. They said they did not want revenge or money. They wanted truth. When the trial began in 2011, it drew global attention. In the courtroom, under the high ceilings of British justice, the voices of the colonized finally echoed back to the empire. The testimonies were harrowing: beatings, castrations, burnings, endless interrogations. The lawyers for the government argued that too much time had passed, that responsibility had shifted to Kenya after independence. But then, the secret archives surfaced, thousands of files once hidden under the code name Operation Legacy, smuggled out of Nairobi before 1963. They contained meticulous records of everything the empire had denied: orders for torture, lists of detainees, reports of deaths, instructions for covering up evidence. The discovery was an earthquake. The courtroom fell silent as the documents were read aloud. The British press, once proud of its imperial nostalgia, printed headlines filled with shame. "Colonial crimes exposed," they read. The lawyers for the veterans stood quietly as the world began to understand what had been buried for half a century. In June 2013, the verdict came. The British government issued a formal apology. The Foreign Secretary, standing before Parliament, declared, "The British government sincerely regrets that these abuses took place and that they marred Kenya's progress toward independence." The state agreed to compensate 5,000 survivors, a gesture symbolic rather than sufficient. But for those who had waited their entire lives, it was not about money. It was about recognition. "We are no longer ghosts," one of the plaintiffs said to the cameras outside the courthouse. "We are witnesses." The news spread across Kenya like a wave of vindication. Radios replayed the apology in both English and Swahili. Newspapers printed photos of wrinkled faces lined with dignity. In the villages, people gathered around battery-powered radios to listen. Some wept openly. Others sat in silence, remembering names long gone. In Nairobi, students marched with banners reading, "The truth has come home." For the first time, the state itself began to speak differently. The government announced plans for a national memorial dedicated to the Mau Mau freedom fighters. It was unveiled at Uhuru Park, a bronze sculpture depicting three figures: a man, a woman, and a child. The man holds a hoe and a rifle, the woman carries firewood and a basket of maize, and the child stands between them, holding a flag. Around the statue's base are engraved the words, "It is better to die on your feet than live on your knees." When the curtain fell away, the crowd stood still. Some applauded, others simply closed their eyes. The sound of drums rose, slow and mournful, like thunder from the soil itself. But reckoning is not the same as healing. The apology did not erase the divisions left by decades of denial. Many Kenyans still lived on land their ancestors had been evicted from. Some of the powerful families that had profited under colonial rule now held positions in government. The past was not dead, it had merely changed form. Younger activists began to push further. They demanded that the government open its own archives, not just those in London, but those hidden in Nairobi's basements. They called for the teaching of the Mau Mau War in schools, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. They asked why the veterans still lived in poverty while politicians built mansions on land once stolen from them. "We cannot celebrate freedom," one activist said, "while the children of those who fought for it sleep hungry." In the slums, murals began to appear. Dedan Kimathi, drawn beside Martin Luther King Jr., next to Nelson Mandela. Underneath, someone had spray-painted the words, "Freedom is a constant struggle." These walls became classrooms of their own, their lessons written in color and courage. Street poets recited verses about the forest, turning oral history into art. Rap songs sampled the speeches of Kenyatta and the cries of the detained. Memory was no longer confined to textbooks. It lived in rhythm, rebellion, and rhythm again. Meanwhile, scholars began to revisit the colonial archives with new eyes. They found records of African police officers who had secretly helped the Mau Mau, of missionaries who had hidden fugitives, of British settlers who had doubted their own empire. History, they discovered, was not a straight line, but a web, tangled, contradictory, alive. The more they studied, the more they realized that the story of the Mau Mau was not just about Kenya. It was about the world's conscience, about how power writes its own memory and calls it truth. Reckoning spread beyond Kenya. Across Africa, countries once told to forget began to remember. In Zimbabwe, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, each had its own ghosts, its own unburied history. Kenya's victory in the London court became a spark for others. It proved that the past could be challenged, that silence could be broken even after generations. The empire, once unquestionable, now faced its reflection in the mirror of time. Yet amid this global awakening, Kenya's own struggles continued. Corruption gnawed at its institutions, elections brought division, the gap between rich and poor widened. In some ways, it felt as though the country had traded colonial chains for economic ones. "The white man left," an old farmer said, "but his system stayed." The irony was painful, but within it lay understanding. Freedom without justice is illusion, and justice without memory is impossible. In 2015, a group of schoolchildren visited the Mau Mau Memorial. Their teacher asked them what they thought it meant. One boy said, "It means they fought." Another said, "It means we are free." But a girl, no older than 12, looked at the statue for a long time and said, "It means we must never lie about who we are." Her voice carried in the wind, clear and certain. The teacher nodded, unable to speak. Sometimes, truth arrives not through history books, but through the innocence of those who have inherited its weight. The veterans' numbers dwindled with each passing year. Their funerals became national events. The lowering of a flag, a bugle's cry, the sound of soil falling onto a coffin. But even as they left behind something indestructible, a consciousness. The generation that had once been told to forget now documented everything: films, podcasts, books, archives. They understood that memory was the only inheritance that could not be stolen. The echoes of reckoning were not always gentle. They unsettled, provoked, demanded. Families discovered truths their grandparents had hidden, oaths sworn, betrayals made, names changed. Some wept, some forgave, some refused. Healing is not neat. It is a conversation between pain and patience, and in that conversation, a nation learns who it truly is. On the 60th anniversary of independence, the president stood once more before the crowd in Uhuru Park. The sun hung high, the air thick with heat and expectation. He spoke of unity, resilience, and pride. But this time, his tone shifted. "We honor the men and women who fought for this land," he said. "We remember the sacrifices that made our nation, and we acknowledge, without shame, without fear, that freedom has a cost we still owe." The words were brief, but they carried the weight of generations. That night, fireworks lit the sky above Nairobi. From the hills, their reflections shimmered on the roofs of the slums and the glass towers alike. In the countryside, old women sat outside their homes, watching the light and murmuring prayers for the dead. And somewhere, in a forest that had once hidden rebels, the wind moved through the trees with a sound like applause. Because reckoning, in the end, is not about guilt or glory. It is about balance, about giving the dead their names back, about giving the living permission to look backward without fear. The echoes of reckoning continue still, in every debate about land, every protest against injustice, every song that begins with the words, "long ago." They remind the people that freedom is not inherited, it is maintained. And as the stars spread across the Kenyan night, the voices of the past and the present blend once more. The ocean that carried chains, the forest that sheltered rebels, the cities that grew from their ashes, all hum the same refrain: remember, rebuild, resist. For memory is the heartbeat of freedom, and Kenya, wounded, wise, enduring, still listens to its own. The sea has no memory, they say, yet it has carried every story that humanity tried to forget. For Africa, the ocean is not a border, it is a witness. It remembers the ships that came for bodies and the ones that returned for power. It remembers the silence between waves, the prayers whispered into the wind. It remembers the blood that dissolved into salt and foam, leaving behind no graves, only ghosts. And when the first Kenyan soldiers stood on the shores of the Indian Ocean after independence, looking east toward the horizon, they understood something unspoken. The struggle for freedom had never belonged to one nation alone. It was a tide that crossed the world. By the 1960s, the tide was rising everywhere. Across the continent, colonial flags were falling like old leaves. Ghana had broken the silence first in 1957, and one by one the others followed: Tanganyika, Uganda, Nigeria, Zambia. The air in Africa was electric with possibility. The speeches of leaders like Nkrumah, Lumumba, and Nyerere echoed across borders, carried by shortwave radios and word of mouth. They spoke of unity, of a continent reborn, of a freedom that would no longer ask permission to exist. And in Kenya, the echoes of the forest oaths resonated again, not as rebellion, but as renewal. The Mau Mau were gone, many dead, many forgotten, yet their ghosts walked beside the living. The same ideals they had whispered in the darkness, land, dignity, justice, became the pillars of the new republic. But freedom's dawn came clouded with contradiction. The men who took power inherited the language of liberty and the structure of empire. The railways still ran from mines to ports, not from villages to schools. The borders drawn in London still divided tribes that had once shared rivers. The police who had once enforced colonial law now wore new badges, but followed the same orders. Independence had come, but the system had stayed. In Nairobi, a new skyline rose, towers of glass and concrete built by the same hands that once built roads for the empire. Foreign companies returned, this time not with rifles, but with contracts. Loans replaced chains, and debt became the new vocabulary of control. The slogans changed, but the power remained uneven. Yet through it all, the people endured. They farmed, they built, they sang, because even when freedom is incomplete, the idea of it sustains. Across the ocean, the winds of struggle took new forms. In the American South, black citizens marched against segregation, carrying placards that read, "Freedom Now." Some of them wore kitenge cloth sent from Africa. Some carried small badges that said Kenya, a symbol of the connection between their fights. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of justice rolling down like waters, the rivers of Africa and America seemed to flow together. The Atlantic, once a path of captivity, became a bridge of solidarity. The descendants of the enslaved and the descendants of the colonized recognized each other in the mirror of struggle. By the 1970s, Kenya was seen as a symbol of post-colonial success, a nation stable enough to attract investors, bold enough to host the voices of Pan-Africanism. Nairobi became a city of conferences, its hotels filled with diplomats and dreamers. Yet, outside those rooms, the old inequalities persisted. The sons of former chiefs now sat in parliament, while the grandchildren of the Mau Mau veterans still plowed borrowed land. Freedom, it seemed, had come with terms and conditions. Still, there were moments of light. In 1978, when President Jomo Kenyatta died, Crowds lined the streets for miles, not out of fear, but of reverence. They remembered him as the man who had spoken to empires as an equal. His successor, Daniel Arap Moi, promised continuity, but continuity is not always progress. Power, once tasted, rarely lets go easily. Under his rule, Kenya began to tighten again, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a noose disguised as stability. Censorship grew, dissent shrank. The government spoke of unity while silencing those who asked too many questions. The forest of freedom began to feel familiar, thick with suspicion, alive with whispers. Writers and poets became the new rebels. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, once a university lecturer, wrote plays in Kikuyu, the language of the people, the language once banned by colonial law. His plays drew crowds from villages to cities, telling stories of workers, peasants, and forgotten heroes. The government saw danger in his words. They arrested him, banned his books, and locked him away in Kamiti prison. But Ngugi wrote anyway, on scraps of toilet paper, with smuggled pens, his words smoldering like coals in a land that had known too much silence. His novel, Devil on the Cross, written in captivity, became a new kind of weapon, not of violence, but of memory. The people read it in secret and whispered, "The struggle is not over." Meanwhile, across Africa, the dream of unity faltered, borders hardened, coups replaced elections, ideals bowed before corruption. Yet, in every failure, there was also persistence, the stubborn belief that tomorrow could still be different. Kenya, for all its contradictions, remained a crossroads between East and West, between old and new, between faith and fatigue. Its history was both a warning and a beacon. The ocean beyond Mombasa still shimmered, indifferent and eternal. Ships came and went carrying oil, coffee, machinery, the lifeblood of a world still shaped by trade that began in chains. Tourists arrived to see wildlife, not realizing they walked on ground once soaked in rebellion. Fishermen still cast their nets where once the colonial gunboats had patrolled. Time, like tide, moved forward, but never far from its starting point. In the late 1980s, the winds began to change again. The Cold War was ending, and with it, the excuses for repression. Western aid now came with demands for multi-party democracy. In Nairobi, protests erupted once more. The police cracked down, the same tear gas burning eyes that had never known a day without struggle. The slogans of the past returned, painted on walls and shouted in rallies, "Justice for all, freedom for all, land for the people." The ghosts of the Mau Mau marched invisibly among the crowds, unseen but present. This time, the chains were paper, not iron, laws, debts, systems, but they were chains nonetheless. When the first free elections in decades were finally held, they brought neither miracle nor collapse, just exhaustion, relief, and the slow, uneven rhythm of a nation learning to breathe again. Change came not as revolution, but as resilience. The people who had survived empire, rebellion, and dictatorship had no illusions left, only endurance. They knew that true freedom was not an event. It was a lifetime's work. In those years, the sea became metaphor and mirror. As global migration rose, young Kenyans left for Europe, America, the Gulf, chasing opportunities their parents had been denied. Some returned, many did not. But even far from home, they carried Kenya with them, in their language, in their names, in their stubborn hope. They told their children about the Mau Mau, about the forest, about the flag with one star, and across oceans, the diaspora began to speak to each other, digital letters replacing waves. The Atlantic that once divided them now connected them again. In art and film, the memory of resistance returned with new power. Directors shot documentaries about the forgotten women of the rebellion. Artists sculpted iron chains twisting into butterflies. Poets spoke of the forest as a living ancestor, and musicians sampled archival speeches into modern beats. Each act was a conversation with history, a refusal to let it fade. And slowly, the image of Kenya in the world changed. No longer just safari and sunshine, but struggle and strength, beauty born from endurance. The global world watched, but rarely understood. To the outsiders, Kenya was either paradise or peril. To its people, it was both, a place where dreams survived in defiance of reality. Every election brought tension, every drought brought hunger, every scandal brought outrage. Yet somehow, the country endured. Because endurance in Africa is not resignation, it is resistance. By the time the new millennium arrived, the ocean's old ghosts had learned to live with satellites and fiber optic cables. The past was now streamed, shared, archived. A video of an old Mau Mau veteran recounting his torture could go viral within hours. The world that had once ignored these voices could no longer claim ignorance, and in that awareness lay a quiet revolution, not of guns or slogans, but of recognition. The story of Kenya had become the story of humanity, how people rise, fall, and rise again, refusing to be erased. One day, a Kenyan filmmaker traveled to the Aberdare forest, where the last Mau Mau fighters had once hidden. He brought a drone, a camera, and a notebook. As he filmed the canopy from above, the forest looked like a vast green ocean, endless, breathing, alive. Later, reviewing the footage, he noticed something strange. The drone's microphone had picked up faint sounds, wind, birds, and what seemed like a rhythm, almost a heartbeat. It could have been coincidence, or perhaps just the echo of his own imagination. But he smiled and wrote in his journal, "The forest still speaks." When his documentary premiered, he titled it, "The Sea That Knows No Masters." The film traveled to festivals around the world. Audiences wept, applauded, and asked the same question: how did these people survive such cruelty and still forgive? The filmmaker answered, "Because the land forgave first. The land teaches you that even after fire, things grow." It became more than a film. It became a philosophy. The idea that resilience is the highest form of power, that the true revolution is not in the taking of life, but in the preservation of it. As the years went by, that message rippled outward. The descendants of settlers visited Kenya to learn about the rebellion their ancestors had suppressed. Some came seeking reconciliation, others redemption. They walked through forests, visited memorials, met families of veterans. There were tears, apologies, embraces. They planted trees together, saplings that would outlive them all. It did not undo the past, but it acknowledged it. And acknowledgement, at last, brought peace. By the end of the decade, the sea off Mombasa glimmered under cargo ships from every corner of the earth. Fishermen still rowed out at dawn, the same way their great-grandfathers had. The world had changed beyond recognition, yet the rhythm of the tide was unchanged. It was the same sea that had seen the slave ships, the same that had seen the colonial frigates, the same that now carried containers and tourists. But it belonged to no one. The sea knew no masters. Standing on the shore, an old woman once said, "We have learned to forgive, but we have not forgotten. The sea reminds us. It always returns what is lost." And as the waves lapped at her feet, she whispered a prayer, not for vengeance, but for remembrance. For that is the ultimate act of freedom, to remember without hatred, to endure without surrender, to live without fear. Kenya's story, like the sea, continues, vast, unfinished, and free. There are fires that destroy and fires that illuminate. The Mau Mau rebellion was both. It burned through villages, through hearts, through certainties, and when the smoke cleared, it left behind something unkillable, the ember of defiance. That ember has traveled through generations, carried not in weapons or flags, but in memory, in stories, in the simple refusal to forget. Today, that ember burns quietly in classrooms, in songs, in the faces of a people who know that freedom, once lit, must be tended forever. In the years after the turn of the millennium, Kenya became a country of contrasts so sharp they could cut the soul. Glass towers rose beside tin-roofed slums. Luxury cars rolled past children walking barefoot to school. Politicians promised progress while scandals devoured the nation's faith. Yet beneath the frustration, there was movement, invisible but real. Civil groups, artists, teachers, and elders began to weave the threads of a new consciousness. They spoke not of rebellion, but of accountability, not of revenge, but of recognition. "We cannot change the past," said one teacher, "but we can stop it from repeating." At universities, young historians digitized archives once hidden away in government vaults. They uploaded testimonies, photographs, and forgotten letters. On the internet, the story of the Mau Mau found new life. YouTube documentaries narrated by descendants of freedom fighters reached millions. Hashtags carried the names of veterans into timelines across the globe. The language of remembrance had gone digital. For the first time, the world could see what colonial reports had erased. The survivors who once whispered their stories into the ears of grandchildren now spoke to an audience that stretched beyond oceans. Their pain became history. Their endurance became inheritance. In 2015, at a symposium in Nairobi, an elderly man took the stage. His name was Ndirangu. He was 90 years old, one of the last living Mau Mau fighters. The crowd fell silent as he approached the microphone, his cane tapping like a drumbeat of time. "They tried to bury us," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "They did not know we were seeds." The hall erupted in applause. Journalists wrote about it for a day. The people remembered it for years. His words became a proverb, painted on murals, printed on t-shirts, repeated at rallies. They summed up the entire journey of Kenya, buried, beaten, but reborn. Outside the academic halls, the struggle took on new forms. Farmers protested for land rights that had been promised since independence. Women's groups fought for justice against violence. Youth movements demanded transparency and jobs. Their slogans echoed the old ones, but with new grammar. The fight was no longer against colonial rule, but against corruption, inequality, and apathy. The enemy had changed, the spirit had not. The same courage that once filled the forests now filled the streets. The machetes had become microphones, the oaths had become petitions, the fire had changed shape, but not purpose. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was beginning to look back at empire with unease. Statues fell in European cities, museums faced questions they could no longer avoid. University students demanded that colonial histories be rewritten, that stolen artifacts be returned. In London, the British government declassified yet another set of documents about Kenya. Reports of massacres once denied, names of officers once protected. Each revelation tore another layer off the old illusion of moral empire. The myth of benevolent colonialism cracked, and through that crack, truth seeped out like sunlight. Kenya's own introspection deepened. A new generation of filmmakers, writers, and musicians began to confront not only the brutality of the past, but the silence that followed it. In 2018, a film called Fig Tree Oath premiered in Nairobi. It told the story of two children, one descended from a Mau Mau fighter, the other from a Home Guard loyalist, who discover their grandfather's intertwined histories. The film's message was simple but devastating. Every Kenyan carried both victim and perpetrator within them. The country wept, argued, forgave, and watched it again. In that collective catharsis, a strange unity emerged, not of agreement, but of understanding. For the youth, history was no longer a burden, it was fuel. Rap groups sampled Mau Mau chants over electronic beats. Painters reimagined Kimathi not as a rebel with a rifle, but as a teacher planting trees. Photographers captured elders holding faded portraits of their younger selves in forest uniforms. Each act of art became an act of resurrection. The line between past and present blurred until it became a circle. Yet, even as Kenya looked inward, the world around it trembled. Climate change dried the rivers that once fed the highlands. Wars flared in neighboring nations. Refugees crossed the same landscapes that had once hidden rebels. The irony was cruel but familiar. History repeating in new dialects. Still, Kenya endured. Its people had learned the oldest lesson of survival, that nations are not held together by perfection, but by persistence. In 2020, when the global pandemic struck, Kenya's streets fell silent again, eerily reminiscent of wartime curfews. But silence does not mean stillness. In that stillness, many rediscovered the meaning of community. Neighbors feeding neighbors, young men planting crops instead of fleeing cities, women sewing masks in village halls. It was not a grand rebellion, but a quiet one, against despair, against disconnection, against forgetting. The Mau Mau spirit had always been less about war and more about endurance, and that spirit resurfaced when the world itself seemed to falter. When restrictions lifted, a national exhibition reopened at the Nairobi Museum, Freedom's Forest, 70 years after the oath. Among the displays was a single weathered notebook. Its pages, yellowed and torn, contained the handwritten testimony of a Mau Mau fighter from 1954. The ink had faded, but one line was still legible. "If I die, let my children know that I died standing." Visitors stood before it in silence. Some took photos, others whispered prayers. In that notebook, they saw not just history but continuity, the unbroken chain between sacrifice and survival. Abroad, Kenya's story began to inspire others again. Activists in Haiti, Brazil, and the United States cited the Mau Mau as proof that liberation is not granted but taken, not through hate but through endurance. Academic journals compared Kenya's rebellion to other freedom movements: Algeria's war, India's independence, South Africa's struggle against apartheid. Each was unique, yet all shared the same core: the right of a people to name themselves, to stand on their own soil without fear. In Kenya, that soil remained both blessing and battleground. Land reform, the dream that had begun with the Mau Mau, was still incomplete. Rich estates stretched across thousands of acres while small farmers fought for scraps. Yet, hope persisted in unexpected places. In the Central Highlands, cooperatives of former fighters' families began to cultivate coffee and tea together, pooling resources to send their children to university. One of them, a young woman named Wanjiku, became a lawyer. In her graduation speech, she said, "My grandfather fought with a panga, I fight with a pen, but it is the same war." The crowd erupted in cheers. Her words, recorded on a shaky phone camera, went viral. In a single night, millions watched her speak. The struggle had found its new voice. The elders say that when a people tell their story long enough, the ancestors begin to rest. But in Kenya, the ancestors are restless still, not with anger, but with purpose. They wait for the day when remembrance and reality finally meet. In the meantime, their voices live in the rustle of the forest leaves, in the songs sung at dawn, in the laughter of children who no longer fear the sound of helicopters overhead. Freedom, once fragile, now breathes. And yet, every generation must claim it again. Freedom dies when it becomes memory instead of motion. The lesson of the Mau Mau is not only about the courage to fight, but the wisdom to sustain. It teaches that rebellion is not a moment in time, but a rhythm, the heartbeat of those who refuse to kneel. As the sun sets over the Aberdare range, the forest glows gold and green. The air hums with life, insects, birds, wind, the same chorus that once hid the footsteps of fighters. Somewhere beneath the soil lie the unmarked graves of men and women who never saw independence, but their legacy grows above them, in trees that sway with quiet pride. Visitors still come, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups carrying flowers or flags. They stand in silence, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. The forest has forgiven, the land has healed, the people have remembered. The sea beyond Mombasa mirrors the sky in perfect blue. Ships move across it like slow, silent shadows. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the rhythm of waves remains eternal. Each crest, each crash against the shore is a reminder. Nothing is permanent, not empire, not oppression, not pain. Only change endures, and in that truth lies hope. Today, Kenya stands not as a nation defined by its wounds, but by its endurance. It is a country still wrestling with inequality, still haunted by corruption, still imperfect, but alive, aware, awake. Its story is not over because no story of freedom ever is. Every sunrise, every protest, every election, every poem, every act of kindness continues the rebellion in quieter forms. The Mau Mau may be gone, but the oath remains, whispered not under trees now, but in hearts, to stand, to remember, to rebuild. And so the story ends as it began, not with victory parades or monuments, but with a promise. The same promise sworn beneath the fig tree in the dark forest more than 70 years ago, that no matter how deep the shadow, the fire of freedom will not go out. It will move from torch to torch, from generation to generation, until the world no longer needs to remember what it means to be free, because it will simply be. The final image fades, a slow aerial shot over the green expanse of Kenya, sunlight breaking through clouds. The narrator's voice, calm and resolute, returns one last time. They took the land, but not the soul. They silenced the voice, but not the song. They buried the body, but not the dream. For freedom, once spoken, cannot die. It waits, it burns, and it returns, again and again, until the world listens. The screen darkens, the music swells, drums, voices, wind, then fades into silence. And in that silence, history breathes.